The Ukrainian Air Force has identified and targeted another position of the occupying Russian army in the occupied territory of Kherson region. A fighter jet belonging to the Air Force struck a control post located in a grain storage area, used by drone operators, with a US-made JDAM air bomb. As a result of the strike, the building was destroyed, along with the Russian soldiers and military equipment inside. It is worth noting that Ukrainian airstrikes against Russian army positions have intensified both in the occupied territories and in Russia's border regions. A significant number of Russian personnel and military equipment have been destroyed as a result of these strikes using Western-manufactured air bombs.
Russia's plans indicate their final transition to the principles of using assault groups as the basis for warfare. This was stated by Andriy Kovalenko, head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council. According to the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council, the Russians are trying to increase recruitment for contracts, including luring conscripts and foreigners. In addition, the Russian army is relying more on motorcycles, buggies, and other vehicles instead of armored vehicles. They are doing all this because in kill zones, armor and people are quickly destroyed by drones, and the only way to pass a zone of 5 to 15 kilometers is on such transport. But there are enough drones now to burn such scooter riders. However, similar plans, which Belousov announces in the Russian Federation, indicate the final transition of the Russians to the principles of using assault groups as the basis for war, the Post says. According to Andriy Kovalenko, this is not critical. Enemy assault groups are operating in the east. They are being destroyed. On the contrary, the Russians are striving to reduce their losses. In general, the mass use of drones, especially those with artificial intelligence, will finally change the role of infantry in war. It seems that this will happen next year, Kovalenko added. He noted that all actions of the Russians indicate that they do not plan to end the war. The West, I hope, understands this, and they plan to wage war not only against us, summarized the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation at the National Security and Defense Council. According to the analysis, while Russia can replenish its troop numbers through aggressive recruitment, its defensive industry cannot produce new tanks and fighting vehicles fast enough to replace staggering battlefield losses, which have exceeded 20,000 units. Having already depleted its best Soviet-era stockpiles, the Russian army is now resorting to meet assaults with unarmored civilian vehicles, a desperate tactic that highlights a fatal flaw in its war-fighting capability and signals a coming crisis. There are still many older Russian vehicles left in some storage yards, but many of these are even older than those that have been mobilized. Satellite analysis shows that some, if not most, of what remains in these Russian storage yards are armored vehicles that have not moved in years. At current costs, refurbishing them is not financially feasible. They are little more than scrap metal. temporarily occupied Crimea is of great importance for Ukraine in economic and military political terms. It is difficult to return it by military means because Russia, together with the countries that support it, has a resource advantage over Kiev. This was stated to the UNN by the first Deputy Minister of Defense, Ivan Havrilyuk. Crimea is a peninsula that has strategic importance in terms of gaining an advantage, especially in the Black Sea and Azov regions. Therefore, Crimea is of great importance, both economically and militarily politically for Ukraine, for Russia as well, Havrilyuk stated. Havrilyuk commented on the possibility of returning Crimea by military means. It is difficult by military means due to the fact that Russia, together with the countries that support it, has a resource advantage over Ukraine. Therefore, the issue of returning Crimea lies both in the military and political spheres. More precisely, it is more in the diplomatic sphere, Havrilyuk said. Ola Kurishko, permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, also commented on the issue of Crimea's return to UNN. In fact, the liberation of all temporarily occupied territories, and this is not only about Crimea, but also about other TOTs, is a guarantee of security and stability. Because in fact, what Russia did with Crimea was to build a military base from which it began a full-scale invasion of the territory of Ukraine. This means that leaving these territories in the status or format they are in now is just a suspension, a certain freezing, but it is not the elimination of the causes and not a preventive measure against what will happen next, Kurishko told UNN. According to her, Russia is currently militarizing people and imprisoning people with pro-Ukrainian positions in the occupied territories. At the moment, it is quite obvious that what the Russian Federation is doing in the TOT is laying the groundwork for the future. The militarization of people living there, forced expulsion, imprisonment of those people who have a pro-Ukrainian position, new colonization of temporarily occupied territories by citizens of the Russian Federation. Everything just points to the fact that Russia will use these territories in the future for war and destabilization of the situation not only in Ukraine but also in Europe, the report says.